It's my pleasure to be here this evening to chair this meeting. My name is Keith Melton, and I am current chair of the Green Liberal Democrats. It also so happens that I was the founding chair of the Green Liberal Democrats back in 1988. I've been elsewhere and done other things since, so I haven't been there all the time. I'm being recycled. So Duncan obviously thought I would be ideally placed to come and talk about the history. I think it's Duncan's show and tell. I'm here, so I'm the embodiment of the Green Liberal Democrats this evening. I also got a fairly clear indication with 3 exclamation marks that I'm going to speak for 3 minutes because we've got experts who are going to be able to tell you lots more about the generality of environmental politics in this country. But I've brought just with me 1 or 2 of the things that you might be able to see on our stand at the Green Liberal Democrats stand tomorrow, including our new line of T-shirts. So this isn't really a sales plug, except that it is. So if you want a T-shirt, come along to the Green Liberal Democrats stand. Right, I'm going to get out of the way now and allow the proper meeting to start. We have 2 very knowledgeable people. And the first of those is Professor Neil Carter from York University, who is going to tell us about environmental politics in this country in liberal democracy.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. This is very much a political scientist overview rather than a detailed history. And I'm going to start with history, but I'm going to come right up to date so people can ask questions about history or contemporary politics. But I thought I'd set the context.
Am I in anybody's way?
Set the context, really. What we might call environmentalism or modern environmentalism emerges around about the late 1960s, 1970s. Yeah, the Victorians had lots of sort of conservation, preservation groups. That's when the National Trust was formed, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds and so on in the 19th century. But what we might now call as modern environmentalism started around 1970. And what I suppose characterised it is first time there was this genuine concern for human survival. There was a real sense of crisis, and it was activist and political in that it was, for the first time, a mass movement, not one coherent, organised movement, but around the world, in the liberal democracies of Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. It became a mass movement. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people got involved in different shapes and forms. I'm not going to do a history lesson of why it emerged at that particular time, but some of the factors that might have that certainly contributed to it was the advent of the atomic age, post Second World War. There was writings of particular popular scientists like Rachel Carson with her famous book Silent Spring, published in 1962, which really put scientific concerns about the environment for the first time out of the scientific community into the sort of the wider public, the media, and so on. We started to see around the world the first sort of huge environmental disasters. I guess the classic one in affected the UK was 1967, the Tory Canyon, the first oil tanker that broke us under. And for the first time, people saw those images, albeit in black and white, on their TVs in those days, of birds covered in oil and so on. And it was also linked to the emergence of what American political scientist Ronald Inglehart calls the post-materialism. In other words, this was the first generation in the 1960s who'd grown up in a period of relative affluence, where they were assured of roof over their head, food on their plate. They didn't have to worry quite so much about material concerns. So they started to cast their minds to quality of life issues like the environment. And that's what fueled these other movements as well, not just environmentalism, but the student movement of the late 60s and a whole range of other new social movements. So that's the kind of context in which environmentalism emerged. But British political parties were very slow to respond. Yeah, we had the government set up on environment in 1970 because it kind of recognised we needed to start addressing some of these issues. But I still tend to think of it as in very much as a silo. Like education or health or defence, we need a department for the environment rather than recognising that addressing environmental issues, you require a kind of a cross-government integrated approach. And at an international level, we saw the first UN conference of the environment in Stockholm. But In the UK, it was pretty slow. There were some fringe grassroots interesting parties. Actually, I think there was a first chart of the Liberal Party did their first sort of pamphlet on the environment or report on the environment in 1972. But the Labour Party set up the Socialists and Environmental Resources Association in 73. There was the Liberal Ecology Group, Conservative Ecology Group. So these were fringe groups within the party, showing that there were small groups of people interested in it, but it wasn't really shaping or affecting the elite, the leaders of parties. The Liberal Party had what's known famously within the party, I think, as the Margate motion in 1979, which was where a group of activists were able to get a motion through which sort of questioned the focus on GDP as a measure of economic growth, and we should have a much more kind of shouldn't just pursue unmediated economic growth. It should be a much more nuanced approach to growth. But really, this wasn't getting through, or when it was, you know, the leadership weren't great fans. So here's a little graph. That's why I've done a presentation part, just a couple of nice graphs and tables to show you. What this is this goes from 1959 through to 92. I'll bring it up to date in a moment. But this is the amount of, within each party manifesto which is devoted to environmental issues. So the idea here is sort of a salience argument that the more a party is talking about the environment or any issue in their manifesto, then the more likely they are to be taking it seriously. Of course, that's not certain. Parties may put in lots of rhetoric and then do nothing, but it's an indicator. And what we can see is none of the parties was doing very much, speaking very much about the environment. Perhaps not surprisingly in the 60s, but even in the 70s and 80s, it was quite a slow, certainly amongst the amongst Labour and the Conservatives. It was quite a slow pickup. And even the Liberals bounced around from 0 in their manifestos in the 60s and 74 to lots in 1979, and that reflected when the Margate motion and the ability to put, there was a lot about the environment and reflection of that in the 1979 manifesto, but it was still very much a minority issue. And what we start to see through the 80s and 1990s was what you might call a midterm kind of process. Parties got interested in the environment between elections. I couldn't resist putting that first publication up there from like Stanley Johnson, father of. Actually has a long record in his role as an MEP promoting the environment. So that's a Conservative publication, a Labour one, and a Liberal one in, again, midterm between elections of 79 and 83. The first real coherent party policies on the environment really only emerged in the mid-80s. Again, a set of then 4 parties, the documents they produced, this is carried on. There was a tranche of documents in 1990 and again in 1994. A couple of moments to note. There was quite a famous speech by Margaret Thatcher on the environment in 1988, where she acknowledged global warming and the need to do something about it. I think it was a pretty brief interest in the issue. I think and it's very specifically about saying we need to take action at the international level, i.e., we Tories don't need to do anything in domestic UK policy about the environment. But it was nonetheless quite a symbolic speech. And then, of course, 1989 European Parliament election, when the Greens famously got 15% of the vote, because of the single constituency approach, plurality voting at that time in European elections, it didn't win a single seat, but they did defeat the Liberal Democrat, or what was it, Liberal Democrat at that time, candidates in every constituency except Paul, I think. So, and that was a real shock to the Liberal Democrat leadership. So that's why we can say, I think, that graph I showed you before, Labour and the Conservatives, and in fact, to jump ahead, bring it up to date, taking us right up to the most recent election, what you see of the Labour and the Conservatives is preference accommodation. They know they need to have stuff in their manifestos and their party programmes about the environment, enough to satisfy the broader electorate, show they've got policies, but they're not trying to compete with each other generally on the environment. They're not trying to outdo each other on the environment, because as long as the other party isn't competing, then they're not going to do that much either. And so Labour's been slightly greener than the Conservatives, but not much in it. Whereas from 1992 onwards, what you see is the Liberal Democrats have much more in their manifestos about the environment. Consistently, since 1992, it's been one of their sort of top 3 priority issues in every manifesto. And, you know, certainly on paper, the Liberal Democrats have a much more progressive policy offering than the others. The Green Party only got categorised in this kind of this database I go to in the last couple of elections. Of course, they have surprising, still more progressive set of policies. So it's been a big issue for the Liberal Democrats since the early 90s. Because there have been tensions, I think the Liberals have been generally more instinctively greener than the old Social Democrats. Certainly when they came together and there were negotiations around this, there were the Liberals have been obviously a strong opposition amongst many Liberals to nuclear power, whereas Social Democrats are much more willing to embrace it. Similarly, the differences of view on growth, on the use of green taxes. But as I say, since 1992, there's been a broad consensus that it should be a priority issue. And of course, that green performance in the 1989 European election was a bit of a wake-up call to the sort of the nascent Liberal Democrat Party, because, you know, clearly the Greens were a potential threat. So the Liberal Democrats, not just because ideologically they might embrace it, but also for, you know, instrumental electoral purposes, there were good reasons to make sure that they could compete with the Greens and perhaps try and secure issue ownership. However, just actually not. It's just like that. I wanted to. Sorry, jump to that slide. Wait a second. I'm just going to go back. Just wanted to go to that table. Despite the Liberal Democrats' efforts consistently since 1992 to push the environment, hasn't done them much good. This is just a selection of polls. There haven't been that many, but this is the Ipsos Mori polls over the decades. And what you see is, despite the fact, as you saw in the manifestos, the Lib Dems are consistently greener and have tried to prioritise it, not usually with much success in their election campaigns. When asked which party is best on the environment, the public doesn't really have a view. In fact, don't know is the biggest group, although that drops significantly when the Greens get included in the most recent polls. Basically, despite all of that, it hasn't, and of course there are explanations that, you know, people forget about the Lib Dems outside the elections, you know, and it's open, all the kind of familiar problems the Liberal Democrats forget their issues on the agenda. But that's quite a stark sort of table, I think, to show the Liberal Democrats, to show how they struggle to get the issue, the agenda. But just to jump back, how do we explain that slow, almost begrudging politicisation of the environment? Well, of course, actually, the environment has consistently been of low political salience in the wider electorate. Until the last election, no election had in every election, fewer than 5% of the voters said that the environment was one of the issues that shaped the way they vote. It's other issues, it's the traditional ones, the economy, taxation, immigration, healthcare, education, so on, that shape the way people vote. It hasn't been environment. It was higher at the last election, 2019, but until then, never. There are, of course, institutional factors. The mainstream parties haven't really had to compete with a successful Green Party like the continent, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, many countries across Europe where there have been strong Green parties, have forced certainly the main Social Democrat left of centre party to respond. Hasn't really been the case so much in this country. It wasn't until 2010 the Greens got their first and still only seat in Brighton. And of course also there's been for a long time a large millions, I mean 4 or 5 million members of the major Green groups in this country. You know, the 10, 12 large Green groups form a powerful lobby, a professional lobby, and they make much of their non-partisan approach. They don't want to align themselves with particular political parties because they feel, probably correctly, they can have more influence if they're seen as non-partisan. So there's been less, so neither the Labour or the Conservatives in particular felt a strong need to embrace the environment. And of course there are both those parties had strong producer interests. Conservatives traditionally linked business. Not so much in some respects these days, given some of the comments of Stanley's son about business in recent times, but traditionally, business, of course, certainly until recent times, were very much resistant to progressive environment policies because that tended to mean either regulations or taxation, and that potentially threatened profit, and so business tended to resist those any kind of suggestion of green regulations where they could. And similarly, Labour, with its strong link to the trade unions on this issue, capital and labour traditionally were as one. If business was worried about the threat to their competitiveness by new green regulations, so too with the trade unions, because it potentially threatened jobs. So both Labour and Conservatives had sort of powerful interest lobbying hard against them taking progressive positions. And ideologically too, the Labour, both parties have problems with embracing many aspects of progressive environmental policy. Both old Labour was a famous document, famous Fabian pamphlet that Crosland wrote in, I think, 1971, where he talked about environmentalists as being middle-class folk who are trying to kick the ladder down behind them and stop working-class people being able to, get the things that they already had. But similarly, New Labour was also reluctant to embrace green issues because New Labour was about aspiration, about Worcester Woman and Mondeo Man, those sort of titles. And they didn't really like the kind of hair shirt kind of emphasis on scarcity and so on, which was often associated with green ideas. But similarly, on the Conservative side, certainly post-Thatcher, the mantras of deregulation and anti-tax also didn't make them unobvious. It meant they were reluctant to embrace progressive green policies too. So as I say, environment not really seen in this country in partisan terms either. So that's kind of the history. I just want to, going back quite some time, but I just want to bring up to date with a couple of slides before I finish. There actually have been a couple of moments where we've seen some quite significant changes. Most importantly, this period, 2006 to 2009-10, when actually for the first time we saw a real party politicisation of the environment. It reflected growing public concern, growing sort of public concern about the science, which was getting stronger and stronger, particularly about climate change and the threat to the planet. Friends of the Earth. I noticed Mike Charles, I think, is speaking at the conference tomorrow, another York resident. Mike was the person behind launching the Big Ask, which was the Friends of the Earth's call for a climate change bill, which eventually became the Climate Change Act. Business, particularly fueled by the Stern report, now were persuaded by not just the scientific arguments, but now the economistic arguments that, well, actually, if we don't do something about climate change, it's going to be a big hit on GDP, on economic growth, and the sooner we take action, the less that will be. There are external factors. Britain was part of in those days, the group of countries trying to push the EU to be a climate leader. And of course, there was international stuff going on, the Kyoto Protocol and the whole kind of international process to get action on climate change. And crucially, there was the Cameron effect. Easy to forget now, but there was a moment, Cameron becomes Tory leader in December 2005. He wanted to get rid of that image. He wanted to detoxify the Tory party image, no longer to be the nasty party. And he just made the environment his signature issue on the grounds that if the Tories start talking about the environment all the time, then people will notice we've changed. And he went off to the Arctic and ran around with huskies and did all sorts of other things. So for a little while, we had a competitive consensus. We had all the parties seeking a consensus that more action was needed on climate change, and they were all trying to briefly out-green each other. And that allowed the Labour government, encouraged by cross-party support, to bring in the Climate Change Act and a range of other measures. And that was that consensus was carried over during the coalition government. Crucially, I think here, having the Lib Dem ministers, Prasoon, Ed Davey at DEC, responsible for climate change. but also they're up against growing Tory backbench opposition and the right-wing press, particularly on issues like onshore wind and green levies. And there was a famous sort of Thomas a Becket moment when Cameron said, won't someone rid me of all this green crap? I don't know if it had any impact, but I've had a couple of articles using that phrase, so it's been quite useful for me anyway. And when Cameron won in 2015, we saw some dismantling. Actually, it's worth mentioning that the pressure in the 2015 election, the party leaders were so concerned about the pushback, about the kind of the kickback from the kind of the right, UKIP, the right of the Tory party, the Tory press, that they actually did a leaders' agreement some months before the election. So Cameron, Clegg, and Miliband agreed basically that whoever won the election would keep the Climate Change Act and would continue to do a range of environmental things, and would agree basically not to talk about climate change during the election campaign. So we're so frightened if it did become an issue of discussion, that the Conservatives would find themselves forced to say, well, we'll get rid of the Climate Change Act or some other similar measure. Cameron did dismantle some climate policy, but basically this was quite a quiet time for the environment until Theresa May's sort of possibly a failure, but an unsuccessful 2017 general election, when one of the reasons why Conservatives didn't do as well as they hoped was seen as the fact they lost lots of votes amongst young people, amongst women in particular, and bringing up the party was seen as a way of resolving this. And so we've got Michael Gove given death row, because he's always high profile, talked about making sure we had a green Brexit. And Theresa May, despite having never really talked about the environment at all, her legacy to Boris Johnson was to enshrine commitment to net zero by 2050. So, final slide, just to bring it right up to date. I'm happy to answer any questions on any of this, but the politics of net zero has become increasingly toxic as well. Initially, no. 29, actually, Boris Johnson embraced the environment, certainly rhetorically. He wanted to make sure the COP26 was a success. It was going to be the first international conference post-Brexit. He wanted to make sure that worked. He talked a lot about green revolution. But as the Independent Climate Change Committee has repeated every year in its annual report, says there's this huge gap between ambition, between the ambitious targets the UK has and the delivery, both the lack of sufficiently ambitious policy and the concerns about the implementation of some of those policies, such as efficient energy efficiency in the home, heat pumps and so on. And there aren't many things I regret about the loss of, this is the only thing I regret about the loss of Boris Johnson, really, in a sense, but compared to his successors, he was, I think, at least probably slightly more than just rhetorically, quite green. He did do some things, and I think we would have seen a lot more if he'd have stayed in hand. But his success has been an apology, really, and an abomination when it comes to the environment. And net zero. I think Sunak in the last few months is making net zero part of in his continuing attempts to sort of try and satisfy the right of the party. I think he's making and certainly whilst Labour in particular had its £28 billion sort of commitment to spending on green infrastructure, I think he decided to make net zero part of his kind of cultural war on woke, which they're going to ramp up and we're seeing more and more of come the election. And net zero becomes part of the litmus test of where you stand on net zero, rather like it was during the Brexit debates. Climate scepticism was sort of seen as part of that kind of litmus test for how blue you were. If you were to demonstrate that you were a true Tory, you had to be anti-regulation, anti-tax, anti-EU, and climate sceptic, or at least climate go slow. And I think ambition, that resistance, that opposition to net zero, really is part of that kind of war on woke we're going to see quite a lot in the coming campaign. So I guess, given Labour's rolling back on its green commitments, question mark, is this an opportunity for the Liberal Democrats with, I think, concern about the environment still high compared to most early elections? Maybe this is a chance that the Liberal Democrats can push through their green agenda and perhaps try to carve out greater issue ownership of that. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Slightly encouraged by the last moment of your speech.
By all means.
We might have a bit of a chance with this next general election. Anyway, let's see. I am going to pass very quickly on to Baroness Kate Parminterr, and Kate's going to tell us all sorts of wonderful things about the history of environment.
Well, thank you, Keith. Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kate Parminterr. I'm one of the peers in the House of Lords. And up until last month, I was the House of Lords Select Committee Chair for the Environment and Climate Region, so most of my working life in this space. But I think I need to tell this audience, I am not a historian. I did theology at university, but I'm attempting tonight to do three things. To tell you, has the environmental issues mattered to us as a party, both when we were the Liberals, SDP, and now as Liberal Democrats? If it has mattered, why it mattered, and should it matter to us going forward now? So in terms of has it mattered, well, clearly the thing to focus on for a political party is when you're in power. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on. But before we get to that, I just want to pinpoint three instances when we haven't been in power, but I think it has signalled our party's commitment to this issue. And one of them Neil has already mentioned, but the first one was back in 1928, when we had the Liberal Yellow Book, which made an extremely strong defence of the countryside and made the case for the establishment of national parks, which wasn't delivered until we had the Labour government in 1949. Let us not forget, it was the Liberals did that, not in power, but we did that. Secondly, and this is the one that Neil has referred to, is the 1979 Liberal Assembly, when, as is the way sometimes our true colours come forth, and the party accepted a motion which said that economic activity being measured by GDP was neither desirable nor achievable. Powerful stuff. Not we were in government, but that again signalled our true colours. And the third instance that I would cite is 1992, which was referred to in passing in Neil's slides, which was when we, for the first time, made the environment central plank of general election. And Paddy Ashdown and others, we had for those of you who were there, will remember we had the 5 E's, and one of them was environment. That was a first for us, and it was a really, I think, quite a pivotal moment for the party. So when we're out of power, those were my 3 instances. But as I say, I want to focus really on when we were in power. Of course, there aren't that many occasions when we were in power. However, let's go back to the 19th century with the Liberals. And although it's not as Neil had sort of slightly skimmed over the Conservative movement as a previous chair of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, I think there's a continuum between conservatism and environmentalism. Back in the 19th century, the Liberals did a lot in terms of conservation. It was the Liberals who introduced the Act in 1866 for the Metropolitan Commons Act, which was about protecting land which had previously had common access. It was the Liberals who went away and introduced legislation so that we could purchase Hampton Court Gardens, Kew Gardens, and Richmond Park. And it was the Liberals, and a man we're going to come back to in a moment, called George Shaw Lefevre, who was Commissioner of Works both in 1880 and 1890, who did something which is still really important to all of us now. How many of you are councillors, by the way? Okay, well, it was George who introduced the legislation under a Liberal government that gave local authorities the statutory duty to protect footpaths.
Right.
Okay. Still important now. And if we think about allowing people to benefit from the environment, to not just save the planet because it's a resource, but actually a resource for our well-being, that was a really pivotal plank of what the Liberals did back in those days. So yeah, don't forget that name, Shaw Lefevre, we're going to come back to. So when we were in government back in the 19th century, we did things that showed we cared. The next, fast forward, the next time was of course during the coalition. when arguably I would say it was our biggest contribution to stopping the worst excesses of our beloved partners. It was us who made sure we had an ambitious forced carbon budget. It was us who introduced the Green Investment Act, which they privatised. It was us who introduced zero carbon homes, which they subsequently got rid of. It was us, particularly Ed Davey, who worked with European colleagues to ensure that the 2015 Paris Agreement was as strong as it could be. It was us who introduced the electricity markets, which ensured that electricity, the renewable energy during the time of the coalition almost quadrupled. All those things because of us, as well as stopping Owen Paterson with his mad plans for GMOs and neonicotinoids, which the current Tory government has introduced. And also on the other side, on the deficit side, introducing the 5p levy on plastic bags. So we did a little bit to try and bring the environment up the agenda when we were in government. So when we've been in government, we have shown it matters to us. So why is that important for us? Well, it seems to me it's pretty obvious. I don't know how many of you are. I don't know the Liberal Democrat constitutional act, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to read it. But the first two sentences tell you why environmental cause is important to our policy. What we say is the Liberal Democrats exist to build safe and safeguard fair, free and open society in which we seek to balance the fundamental values of liberty, equality and community, and in which no one should be enslaved by poverty, ignorance or conformity. We go on to say, we believe that each generation is responsible for the fate of our planet, and by safeguarding the balance of nature and the environment for the long-term continuity of life and all its forms. That's the first two sentences of our preamble. That says it all about why the environment really, really matters to us. And it also, for me, says why the environmental movement and liberal democracy, for us, it's never going to be about a biocentric view of why environmental policy is important. We're never going to be the Greens. For us, it's about stewarding the resources that the environment are to ensure that we use those to harness them for the benefit of people and to ensure that they are there for future generations. We do not have a biocentric view of the environment, to my mind. We have a view which is about we are here to steward and shepherd these resources. So it's fundamental to who we are. That's why environmental movement is important. There is another reason why we have consistently focused on the environment. And that's because there have been people at strategic points in our history who have made the case. For me, there are about 4 people. A few more, but I'm going to take you through them. The first one is, let's go back to George Shaw Lefebvre, who went on to become Lord Everest. In my mind, he is a great man. He is great because he instigated the first conservation society. He instigated the Commons Preservation Society, which is still going today as the Open Spaces Society. It was the first conservation movement. And who did he form it with? He formed it with John Stuart Mill. He formed it with Sir Charles Dyke. He formed it with Henry Fawcett and 2 other MPs. Now, I've never heard of them, but I'm sure in this Liberal group, you'll have heard of 2 people, Thomas Hughes and John Bryce, Liberal MPs. Those 5 people and 1 other woman, Octavia Hill, who 30 years later went on to form the National Trust. But it was that group of Liberals, radical Liberals, who formed the first conservation society, which went on to do so much in this space. And George not only formed it, he was the chairman for the rest of his life. So for me, George is a bit of a hero, and I was a bit disappointed nobody's written a biography. But because I'm in the House of Lords, I went to the library and I said, he's written a book, he wrote a book in 1910 called Commons, Forests and Footpaths, which documents the history of how he formed the society and made progress towards common ownership. And when we've got the Rwanda bill on people on Wednesday night, I'm not allowed to take it out of the library, but I'm going to be there for a very long time on Wednesday. I'm going to be reading George's book. And if anyone's interested, send me an email after next week and I'll send it back. So George is a hero. The second lot of heroes is not one person, but it's picking up a point that Neil said, which is about obviously the environmental movement came very much to the fore in the world in the 60s and 70s with Rachel Carter's book, Silent Spring and other things. And that was exactly the time that we as a party was getting stuck into local politics, where our council base really took root. And we saw in our local communities that environmental issues were not only things of concern to people, because people were aware of the environmental issues, hearing more and more about because of it in the media, but also they could see it as an expression of liberalism on the ground. And they could see they wanted to do things. It's why local councils, Liberal Democrat councils, have such a good track record on the environment. And why, when a number of our good councils went on to become MPs, like Andrew Stoll or Diana Maddock, they introduced environmental private members' bills in House of Lords. And it's why now we have 3 out of the 5 councils in England which have the best recycling rates are Liberal Democrat. It's why we have South Cambridgeshire, which has a doubling nature strategy policy, and a whole raft of environmental initiatives by local councillors. So I would say that coalescence of the party and its grassroots activity in the 70s merged seamlessly with the environmental considerations around us. So, George Shaw Lefebvre, 1970s councillors, and then to bring it up to date, I would say that Ed Davies actually had a very good record on the environment. And Duncan will know this better than me, but when he was at DEC and Coalition, Ed was really strong on ensuring that environmentalism was viable. And that is to his credit. And last year he gave an excellent speech at the Wildlife and Countryside League meeting in Parliament, where he talks about his own commitment to climate change, sustainability, and nature. He's done extremely well. He has shown his commitment to that issue. So I think that bodes well for our future. So there's these people up, you know, in the party at the senior levels and then the local council level. But to my mind, there are 3 men in the undergrowth who for the last 20 odd years have been responsible for ensuring that environmentalism plays a significant part in this party's DNA and manifesto. One of them is in this room. 3 men in the undergrowth. One of whom's over there.
Yeah.
Another one is Neil Stockley, and the third one is Dr. Richard Benron, who's chairman of Wildlife and Countryside League, was a Liberal Democrat PPC at the last general election, was a spag to Michael Gove, and is a renowned expert. But those 3 men in the undergrowth have been responsible for keeping environmentalism at the forefront and are to be given more of the public profile than they get. Well, then, has it mattered, and why it's mattered? Why it's mattered because it's part of our fundamental DNA as a political ideology, and because we've had people at the right time. Does it matter now? Well, of course it matters now for us as a party, because if we're going to be serious, we have to address the sustainability crisis that we face as a globe, let alone as a country. More than that, for me, it's about environmentalism actually expresses who we are as a party. And I would choose 5 things, I think, to say why it expresses who we are as a party. Firstly, we are a party that believes in stewardship, not just in the preamble. Conrad Russell made a famous statement, which was that sustainability is the fundamental responsibility of trusteeship. That is what it's about, sustainability. And that is why it should be important to us as a party. And it's why I'm very hopeful that in the manifesto in the general election, we will be playing up those policies that we now have, which are about stewardship. Policies like doubling nature, which is about ensuring that we reverse the decline in biodiversity and we move forwards, we'll move towards 2050, so that future generations can have that restored biodiversity which we know they are. Secondly, for me, it's about enfranchisement. We are as a party in favour of giving people the vote and involving people in decisions which affect their lives. Well, in the environmental sphere, that's about ensuring people have a right to have a say, that they have the right to challenge, they have the right to be involved when decisions about the environment are taking place, because we know there is great social inequality for environmental decisions. It's why at the Autumn Conference we passed a motion for an Environmental Rights Act, That is the right thing that we should be doing as a party in my opinion. Thirdly, it's about dispersing power. We've always been about dispersing power, about ensuring that bring power down to the lowest possible levels in whatever field we're talking about. In the environment, that's about ensuring that we take away some of the power from people where they are abusing it badly, such as water companies, and why we are in favour of ensuring that water companies become social benefit companies. We are internationalists. Well, you know, the environment doesn't finish at our shore. It's why we should be playing strongly and why we should be talking again, working with Europe on things like pesticides, on chemicals, on participating in international measures, because the environment is a global issue. We've done that in the past, we've had a good record on that in the past, we need to do it. And then the last two, one is effective markets. We are in favour, we're not. Looking back, and I mean, I'm not a historian, but my view, even of sort of liberals who were regarded as sort of the laissez-faire, sort of free marketeers, my view is that they did quite a lot on social issues around the environment, but they weren't aware of the environmental consequences. Now we're aware of the environmental consequences. We as a party have to make sure that markets work properly. And it's why we've had a good record when we were in the coalition with things like contracts for difference, and why in our policy papers now we're talking about developing further things like biodiversity and again, making the markets work efficiently for the environment and for people. So all those aspects together, I'm running out of time here, so I should have to be brief. It doesn't come without challenges for the party. And as Neil has rightly said, we need to do, we need to be, there are opportunities for us as a party, and particularly if we want to ensure that Green members and Labour members surrender their vote in certain target seats, we need to have a strong pitch. It's important that we do it. But we also need to recognise there can be challenges because, as Neil has said, the Tories are going to use this as a bridge issue. They are going to play up three things. They are going to play up the fact that where we are at the moment with environmental space, a number of the things that need to change are going to cost money. If people are going to put in heat pumps, if people are going to move to electric cars, all those things are expensive because we're at the early stage in the technology. And it's absolutely crystal clear since September last year that Rishi Sunak is going to use that and say it's going to cost you money. And for us as Liberals, we need to be honest, and we need to say we want a fair approach to this. We recognise that there are costs, but we need to ensure that the people who have broader shoulders pay their rightful contribution. And I mean, those of you in the rally, you saw the signing of Fair Deal. Environmental policies again show us that we can play that point that this has to be a fair transition. It's also tricky because for some in our party, it's not particularly liberal that you're limiting choices. Some people, when you're sort of saying, well, you can't do some things, you need to do other things, that doesn't sound particularly liberal. However, what we are actually doing is we're saying we need to think about the needs of future generations. And we also need to be rather better at the party, and I think we haven't been good enough in spelling out why we need to be doing this now, that it's good for people, it's good for their health, there are green jobs out there, and we need to spell out to be effectively loud and proud on the environment, whereas in fact I think sometimes we prefer not to do that. And thirdly, the issue, and this is one where I think we are quite vulnerable, is that there are a lot of institutions and vested interests in the status quo. And that's equally true of big companies in the fossil fuel industry, as it is for rural communities where there are oil and gas facilities and there are farming communities. We as a party, with our slant towards rural seats, have to be really honest about some of the challenges and how it needs to be a just transition. And it's why I was really proud when the farming paper came to the party last year that we talked about putting extra money into supporting those farmers as they moved away from a model which encouraged them to use more fertilisers and to effectively prioritise purely food production, and to move to a system which built in environmental considerations as well. But those three things, cost, the sort of the changes to people's lifestyle, and the fact that there are vested interests, means we're going to have to be solid in our position on this and can move forward. So I've rattled on for too long, but I think what I wanted to say to you, to show you, was it has mattered consistently to our party in the past, and it's mattered because it's a fundamental part of our DNA, and it's mattered because there have been people at key times in the party who have kept it going. And what I want to say today is that I hope in the manifesto and in the general election, we are loud and proud on the environment, not just because it's the right thing to do for the party to mop up votes for Greens and Labour, and not just because it's a climate crisis, which it is, but because it says who we are. It's part of who we are, about why we're here on a Friday night in New York, because we believe in ensuring that for all people there is an environment in the future that they can benefit from.
About myself, a couple of quick remarks. Firstly, one of the things you missed was the picture of the Earth from space. That was one of the biggest drivers of appreciation of the environment. And I'm really delighted that you read that sentence out. I actually wrote it in 1980. We had a series of groups and commissions setting up the preamble, and everybody was collecting little bits of paper, and I was pressed for a sentence, so I wrote that sentence, and I'm really, really proud of it. I'm also proud of the fact that it's now second sentence, because until 2021 it was buried in the middle of the second paragraph, and we brought a motion to the conference to move it in. Anyway, I'm rambling on. I think you would like a little bit of plugging time.
Just a quick commercial for the Lib Dem History Group. Thanks very much. My name is Duncan Brack. I'm editor of the Journal of Liberal History. And for those of you who don't know us, the History Group was set up when this party was founded, in the merger in 1988. And our aim is to increase understanding and research and discussion of where we came from, our history, exactly the kind of thing we've been talking about today. What liberalism meant at various times in history, how it's built up to where we do, what we do, what we say today, and what liberals did at various times in history. And we do this in four main ways. We organise meetings like this one. The next meeting, we do meetings in London in between conferences, but these are available on Zoom. You can log into them. And provisionally, the next one is looking at the liberal record, the liberal involvement in the Middle East in the early years of the 20th century, because of course the Balfour Declaration, which created the principle of a national home for Jewish people, was published under a Liberal government, led by Liberal coalition government, led by Lord George. And then Liberals had a history in the establishment of the State of Israel and the Middle East more broadly. So obviously a sensitive subject here, but we are hoping to organise a meeting on it. And then we'll have a fringe meeting at the autumn conference if the election campaign allows us to have an autumn conference. Second thing we do is publish the Journal of Liberal History. This is our regular publication, a quarterly. This is issue 121. Contains articles, biographies, reports of meetings, book reviews, and more. And you can subscribe to it either in print or digitally, and you can do that at our stand in the exhibition area. Third thing is we publish a range of research resources, books and booklets. And this is our latest one. What have the Liberals ever done for us? Which we published last autumn. And basically it's a record of the greatest achievements of Liberal Democrat governments and politicians for the last 350 years. And of course, there's a chapter on the environment, so it's a bit more detail on some of what Kate was talking about. And lastly, we maintain the website at liberalhistory.org.uk. You can see various bits about the history of the party. You can see what we publish, and you can subscribe if you like, which is a mere £30 a year for 4 issues of that, or £25 each. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Duncan. I think we've got 25 minutes left. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So questions, comments, real enthusiasm. I'm going in the order that I saw them. 1, 2, 3, 4. So, number one.
Yeah,
Introduce yourself quickly.
So I'm Paul Fox. I'm a member in both. I'm chair of Western Counties and I'm treasurer of the Liberal Democrat History Group. I was just looking at the sort of very interesting sort of policy history. And when you got to the slide 2006-10, you had a whole series of things, and I felt the inflection point wasn't the 2010 general election, it's the 2008 financial crash. And I just wonder whether there's a theme here that as the economy gets better, people get more interested in environmental matters. But as it gets worse, they get more interested in pocketbook, and they see those two things as in tension with each other or in conflict. And maybe that's what Crosland was saying in 1971. And that's what the Tories are now playing on, rightly or wrongly, after the by-election in Uxbridge. And I was reflecting on this because I went to India for 2 weeks in February. I hadn't been to India before. And I was struck by the scale of what decarbonisation actually means at a global level when you consider the population of India as 1.4 billion people. And the important leadership role that the UK has, given our history. But in the absolute changes that we can make here, it's pretty minor in the global scheme of things. And their economy is all about growth and development. And I didn't see a lot of concern about the environment. I just connected all those things in my mind. I think that's helpful or unhelpful, but that seems to me as a challenge.
Shall we take a couple of questions and then go to a couple of others? So,
Yeah,
just say who you are.
yeah, Tony Vickers, now part of the ruling executive in West Berkshire Council. Taken a long time to get there, but also you might know me through Walter. But I was interested, Kate, you mentioned John Stuart Mill. I think that whole era from the earliest days of the Liberals is significant because at that stage, liberal economics recognised the distinction between land as an economic factor and capital. And I think that the fact that's been lost or nearly lost, but still lives on within this party, I think it's highly significant. And now it's, I think, significant that all the world religions are now focusing much more on green issues. Because really back in the 19th century, the Liberals were a sort of a non-conformist. They were driven by a sense of the rightness of stewardship. And I just wondered what the speakers thought of that as really the formation of liberalism within the core of our beliefs.
Okay, shall we start with Kate and then go to Neil?
Can I just pick up a couple of points? On Tony's point, I mean, I think the point about faith playing an increasingly important role now in the environmental movement is absolutely true. And we see much more the term environmental justice, which I think is a result of faith-based communities coming into this space, which I think is really helpful. And I think the whole idea of climate justice is important because it also expresses, it takes us not just from sort of a national perspective, it makes us think about, you know, our contribution to other parts of the world where the effects are being felt more forcefully than they are. I mean, they are being felt forcefully here, but even more forcefully there. So I think that's a really positive step that the faith groups are getting into that space. And another reason why I think it's really important is because one of the interesting things we did on our committee was when we looked at if we're going to get to 2035 in terms of our net zero figures, how much of the greenhouse gas savings that are going to be needed will have to come from people and making them change their individual ways of their lives. And the answer is that a third of all emission savings between now and 2030 will have to come from individuals. It's not necessarily a big change in the electricity system, it's about, you know, what we eat, heat pumps, electric cars, what we buy. And so picking up that point that, you know, there is a justice issue there is really important when you think about so on faith groups, I think it's really important. And on Paul's point, I just wanted to pick up one thing, which is yes, India is really interesting, and they are a bit of a laggard when it comes to sort of COP negotiations. But I will take slight issue with your point, you know, because I hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, because India are, you know, I think they aren't doing very much, China aren't doing very much. What can, you know, it really doesn't matter about what they do. Well, for two reasons, that's all alone. One, because despite the fact that we, you know, are governed by such a complete shambles, and the sooner we get rid of them, the better, Britain, for reasons like the Climate Change Act and various other things, has a historical leadership in this space. And so,
Not leisure, I was
Yeah.
asking about the actual
yeah,
impact.
no, but, so I'll come on to that. So I still think we do have a historical, but equally, in India and China, where they're making all this stuff, they're making stuff that we buy. We are buying it. So we can't, say it's not us, Gav, let's worry about what's happening in China and India. Because it's about our model of consumption and the fridges we're buying and the clothes we're buying and the fast fashion that's coming from India and the fridges from China. We cannot say that somehow we don't have a stake in this. It is not just about climate, it's not just about biodiversity, it's frankly about overconsumption. And that matters to me as much as it does to Indians.
Yeah, so well, absolutely, I think there always has been this, I don't think it's always inevitable, but there always has been a tension between, economic growth. In fact, the classic opinion poll kind of question is, what's more important, economic growth or environmental protection? And I think quite clearly that it's not hard to find links between people's concern being higher in times of economic good times, and absolutely, there's times like now, times of 2008, people are worried about food on their plate and whether they've got jobs, so on, and that's understandable. Of course, and it was one thing worth noting though. I mean, a lot of the interest, a lot of the spending, a lot of countries, their way out of the financial crisis in 2008 was by attempts at green growth, particularly Korea, particularly USA. Obama put a lot of money into green growth solutions. In a sense, that's much of what was behind Labour's 28 billion is always a crazy sum, but the intention behind it is absolutely sound. That there's jobs and there's welfare. There's it's crucial for it to be a just transition, exactly as you say, to make sure that the jobs that go in the gas and oil industry, that those people get retrained and there are new jobs come in. But there are going to be loads and loads of jobs in the new green technologies, and it's about making sure that it's a just transition. So it doesn't have to be. So I think the transition to a low carbon economy doesn't have to be at the cost of economic growth. We need different kind of economic growth, and it doesn't have to be at the cost of jobs, so on. So yes, there are tensions between that, but I don't think it's an either or. On India, India always has been, as you mentioned, a bit of a not just a laggard, but a resistor in international climate negotiations. Equally, huge numbers of solar farms are springing up in all right across India, just as China. China's for all the bad, for all the coal-fired power stations it's opening. Equally, the extent to which it's invested in renewable energy, wind energy, solar, EVs, just dwarfs every other country virtually put together. So it's doing really good things as well as still doing bad things alongside. So, but I think the key thing about China, and this goes back to the process thing, doesn't it? That we need to make sure that India, we need to make sure that the development in the global south is a greener development. So I think where we can make a difference, we and other rich countries, is climate finance. We can put, we keep making these promises every year at the protocol. We're going to put so much money in, so many billions, and it never materialises. We need to deliver that. So that's true. I confess I'm not an expert on faith and environment, but it strikes me that exactly your answer was right. That just transition is the key message here. That and it seems to me where people representing different faiths can stand up for their communities. That's crucial, and we see that a lot in the global south in some of the fights, particularly against big corporations who are exploiting, polluting the environment there. I think it's often faith leaders who are the leading the resistance, but also in from the pulpit, persuading people of the importance, across all religions, the importance of these kinds of changes. Absolutely crucial role. Great.
It's interesting that we spent within the Liberals, we've spent a lot of time over the years telling people how bad things can be. We now have an opportunity to say the things that we can do to make it right. Well, there, if you like to introduce
Yeah, so Jeremy Sanders, Kern Valley. I was just wondering if there's sort of people that felt that the evidence of the last sort of 30 or 40 years in some ways is that sort of there was a real problem with how environmental issues are tackled within the current democratic structure. Because invariably what you're talking about is things that are comparatively long-term issues, things where you're talking about things that need to be tackled in 20 years, 50 years, or whatever, but potentially doing things that will affect how people live now. So, and I think that, you know, there is a certain amount of evidence. If you look at things like the by-election in Boris Johnson's seat in London, the issue with ULEZ, that no one was really saying what's the problem with pollution in London, but what people were saying, we don't want to suffer now, personally, to solve this in the long term. Equally, if you're talking about 10 years ago, with protests about fuel prices, where the moment they happened, all the political parties ran away from the idea that you should actually be defending having higher fuel prices, because it was unpopular with people. It meant paying no more now for environmental things which would be effective in the future. I mean, even within this party, I mean, I seem to remember about 10 years ago, we had a motion on reducing the economic consequences of cheap air flights, which everyone was funny. But like I say, this won't affect actually ordinary people. It'll only be some vague, very rich people who will be affected by it. You know, you know, do people feel this is this is an issue that doing something now doing something unpopular now for a benefit in the long term is a very difficult thing to do through the existing political system, which works on the basis of what people are voting for now.
To that question, we'll go to the next question.
Couple of very comments. So my name's Ian, I'm from York, Ian Nine. Kate, you said you're not a historian, but you can certainly pass for one. On the outsourcing of our manufacturing and so on, I think the solution there is carbon border adjustments, as the EU has done, but extended to other products, and perhaps even other concepts like a wage border adjustment to tackle the problem that low wage economies are taking over. Anyway, a question for Neil. You talked about the competitive consensus, and it feels like the Tories are exiting or have exited that. Can we get them on board, or is it too late? Or will a good hammering of Wilson help? Or what else in terms of narrative, or things that we should avoid, or things that we should talk about to restore that consensus? Because I think that has been the basis for what progress we have made, and I don't want to see us going down the American.
Okay, first you this time.
Well, maybe start with you. Yeah. So I think in political science, people talk about valence issues and positional issues. So that the environment was always regarded as a valence issue. In other words, an issue where everyone basically agrees on the outcome. We all want to protect the environment. No party's going to, campaign to trash the environment, are they? But they kind of disagree on exactly how to get there, or on the priority they give to that issue, as opposed to positional issues like, immigration. Can't be for or against taxation, for or against, so on. So, and I think, the reason I say that is I think the environment probably used to be a valence issue in this country, but there are definitely over the last decade or so, there have been certainly coming from the particularly conservative right and some of the right-wing media, Mail, Express, etc., an attempt to make it much more of a positional issue, as we see in America, where it's a starkly polarised issue in America and in Australia. And I agree with you. I think that is one of the problems that clearly on the right of the Tory party, they've got this net zero scrutiny group. I think the reform, pressure from reform, all of that is about a genuine opposition to the very idea of net zero, really. Now, I think there's still an awful lot of Conservatives who are not of that ilk and recognise the importance of the environment, but how many of them will be around after the next election, I'm not sure. But So, but I do think there is that a genuine issue that we are starting to see, and it's not just, sorry, in the UK, the rise of the radical right across Europe, and watch this space. The European Parliament elections in June are going to see a surge of radical right parties across Europe who will push back in the EU against its attempts to be a climate leader. So, there, you know, I think there really is a genuine danger of it becoming, climate change in particular, becoming an increasingly polarised issue. And yet you're right, of course, one of the challenges of the environment is always you need to act now to protect future generations. And that does mean there will be losers now, or, you know, that in a sense we pick up the costs now in order to protect the long term. And the, you know, the 4 or 5 year electoral cycle is not designed for long term action. You know, it's not just environment, it's forming social care and all these other endemic issues that we're always talking about need to be resolved, but never seem to be resolved. And, you know, short term electoral cycles, concern to, you know, make sure that tomorrow's headlines, these days it's right to get the next hour's headlines on social media, you know, and the next opinion poll in the election. That doesn't work well for long-term policy solutions. So yes, it is a problem, but it's somehow one we've got to embrace and take on. But
the Liberal Ecology Group produced a manifesto in 1978. About 80% of that is still relevant now because they've put it in Lisbon now. Sorry, apologies for that.
Thank you. I think just sort of pick up what you were saying in response to sort of Jeremy's question. It's not just about there is a need for better leadership by political parties to articulate the benefits both to our generation, you know, in terms of, you know, nearly 30,000 people die a year from air pollution. We move to EVs, that's going to help. We're pretty bad at articulating as nationally the benefits, as I think I mentioned. But going back to a point that Neil made earlier, it's much easier to do that sort of leadership job when there is cross-party consensus, as there was at strategic times in the past, either when they were introducing the Climate Change Act under Labour, or when, as before that election, the three parties came together. So it is harder when we can see at the moment that the Tories are trying to drive a wedge. But it's not just about leadership. I think there are 2 other reasons why it's particularly difficult in the UK to deal with that issue of green issues where, you know, if you're going to put in a heat pump, it's going to cost you more and it's going to be, you know, more inconvenient first for people to make those choices. And there are 2 reasons. One, because we are rubbish in the UK at getting green policies that are people-centric. You know, when we tried to introduce under the Coalition Green Deal, which is this great plan to introduce home insulation, which we know we've got to tackle as a country, given the state of our housing stock, the Treasury insisted that the amounts were too low, so it was never going to work. And we're rubbish at actually developing policy, which actually starts from what is it that people want. And with EVs at the moment, the upfront costs are too expensive and the infrastructure's not there. And yet we're expecting people to make the choices now. So we're rubbish at policy making on space. And there's one other thing where we're weak, and that's about consent. In this, I mean, with the whole ULEZ thing, I think people would have been a lot better. They actually felt it wasn't being done to them, it was being done with them. And we've seen in the past things like climate assemblies, certainly in France and in Ireland and other places, where you take people on the journey of why we need to do this. It actually helps the process of getting people to where we need them to be. And just in the UK, we're just really bad at that. And I think this is actually something where I mean, it's not, we can't solve the problem, but it's where I think there is an opportunity for Liberal councillors, you know, to be running. I mean, I know that they're running on the shoestring. I mean, not even a shoestring, they're running on nothing. They're running on. But to actually have climate assemblies, to actually bring people into the conversation about why this is important, what we can do, I think would be really another way of engaging with our local communities. Whereas I think nationally we are pants at green policy and pants at getting consent.
And if you do climate assemblies, tell me, because I've got a PhD student working on it.
We're going to try some in New York. We've had 4 male hands questions. I'm minded to take female hands if there are any questions from our lady members of the audience. No, okay, all right. I'm trying my best for gender equality.
Question, Tim. Just getting back to what Paige just said about bringing people with you. I mean, I think probably other people in this room were involved in something maybe called the Greening campaign a little while back. And that was about bringing people over. And it sort of went up and then it went down again. But it's probably left a seed there. So there's probably lots of things going on in the community, which is lower level. Are you talking about sort of starting with little issues or the big issues? Or?
I think both. I mean, I just think locally, you know, if you've got issues around traffic proposals that you want to bring about, then I think, you know, that's a good way of doing it. But also engage, I mean, because one of the things that we've learned from the French example is that if they're going to work, then the people who commission a climate assembly actually have to have some purchase on the decision making. Because we tried one nationally in the, I'm sure your PhDs, you know, we'll go into this in detail, but in the UK we did one which the UK Parliament commissioned, the Climate Assembly, which was really great, it was really well thought through, really well over a couple of weekends. It was a great TV program, actually, people want to watch it, and looked at how we could solve, you know, how we can make people change their behaviours to deal with the climate assembly. But it was commissioned by the British Parliament, and so the Parliament then presented it to the government, and the government said, yeah, thanks very much, but no thanks. They didn't have a purchase on the decision making, whereas in France, when they had the climate assembly, it was commissioned by Macron. So when the results were out, although he didn't do all of it because he had some problems from the Gilets jaunes and various others, a lot of the recommendations did get through. And that's why I'm in favour of local people being involved in, it's good to be involved with getting them to think about the national issue, but actually where there's some purchase on a local environmental issue.
It's about changing your way of life.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a comment about women not asking questions here, but you'll find out in the community, you might not come and sort of make a big noise and ask questions, but it's women that are doing the work at the ground level in environmental issues. I went to sustainability fair the other day. All the stores were manned by women. I'm involved in several local environmental groups, all women. So just because we're not here making a noise, it doesn't mean that we don't care and we're not doing something, okay?
I
Just
understand
don't
that.
tend to go out and shout about it so much. We just go and
I understand. Yeah, great. I was trying to help.
be helpful. People ask questions that they need to ask questions. They don't need to be made to feel that they're just sort of sitting there like little mice. We don't say things that we don't think we need to. Okay?
Having said that, Martin Hall, who is the president. Martin.
I'm very remiss in having turned up so late that I'm really upset to have missed the first speaker. So I'm going to rely on Keith to stop me if I'm about to ask about something that's already been covered. I just wondered if anyone had mentioned the 1974 Liberal Party Environment Panel, which produced a report which is really impressive, actually. It warned about the risks of growth, of pollution, of waste of resources, and about something which is rather poetically called the world's temperature balancing mechanism, for which we climate change. And that's nice, nerdy, liberal history for an environment like this, but it's politically rather useful if you ever have a Green Party opponent, as I have had, stand up and say that the Green Party is responsible for pushing the other parties into environmentalism. Because you could say, actually, we were warning about all of this, including climate change, before they were even formed.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.